One of the fun formats that we have drafted in recently was an FFPC Superflex Tournament draft that you and I were both in separately, with a decent number of other RotoViz writers in there as well. And Colm, you were able to continue your hot streak, getting the number 2 overall pick.
Yeah, I have to admit, I have been on a pretty hot streak, and you poked some fun at me in one of our recent drafts where I was saying that I was, kept having to decide, do I have too many of the players at the 2-3 turn when I'm drafting from, a 101, 102 or 103 spot. In this draft, Shawn, I got the 102. We may touch on a draft in a minute. I got the 101 in. And the good run continues. So long may it last. But I drafted, Shawn, from the 102, and then you drafted in this one from the 111. So it gave a really different perspective of how the draft played out. But it also meant that while I was picking at the 102, I was also very aware of some of your prime candidates of players who maybe other drafters wouldn't be targeting in those ranges. But I was thinking ahead to, are these guys getting back to me? Because I know who Shawn's targeting, particularly when we're trying to get certain structures in these drafts. So you mentioned the other guys, and I was drafting back-to-back at the 103 with Zachary Kruger, my partner in crime on the RotoViz Best Ball show. But Jonathan Taylor went with the 101, Shawn. I think then at that point, it has to be the clear-cut pick to get Josh Allen as the 102. That's kind of he's usually going as the 101. But the question I would have there is, taking Jonathan Taylor in Superflex, is that something that you'd be willing to do at the 101 for me in these drafts? And I'm currently in another one of them, and it's a slow draft. Up onto the 105 is where I would start to get into consideration. So Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson. Then I'm probably going Joe Burrow, Kyler Murray, and Jalen Hurts. It's very hard to pass up on one of those guys in the Superflex format when you get into the next quarterbacks after that, Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott, Tom Brady. They're the ones where I kind of start thinking about maybe pivoting. How do you feel about Jonathan Taylor as the 101 in the Superflex format?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Not everybody, Colm, is in a situation where they have so much Jonathan Taylor that they're just willing to throw that to the side and not worry about it. If you had taken Taylor at the 102, or in this case, taking Christian McCaffrey, then you would have been able to select your guy, Aaron Rodgers, at the 211 and come back with Justin Fields at the 302. So you would have had some options there. But obviously starting out with the quarterbacks makes sense. Ben and I did select Christian McCaffrey late in a draft. Blair and I selected Jonathan Taylor early in one of these drafts, I think at the 102 or the 103. You can make that work. You can pull up the roster construction explorer and see the results there. Obviously, the best way to approach this is to have a quarterback early, either QB start, or at least one QB in the first 2 rounds. And when it came back to me at the 111, Cooper Kupp and Russell Wilson also off the board, in addition to the elite QBs that you mentioned. I went ahead and took Christian McCaffrey, the player who probably has the most upside in 2022 when we look at non-quarterbacks, and probably able to distance himself more from the running back position, even than these top quarterbacks are from the QB position. So I like that element of it if you get stuck. And then as it comes back around in a variety of these leagues recently, I've started with Christian McCaffrey and Jamar Chase, or Christian McCaffrey and Cooper Kupp. And one of them started Cooper Kupp and Jamar Chase to get those 2 wide receivers early. In this one column, I did go ahead and take Trey Lance so that I would have that foundation QB. We're trying to refrain from talking him up too much because we don't necessarily want him to jump multiple rounds, especially in non-Superflex formats. We want him to be a key part of that QB window approach. But here he was too much to resist, even with players like Justin Jefferson, Travis Kelce, and Jamar Chase still on the board. I think that all 3 of them would have also been interesting. But when you're in the back here, similar to the problems that you have in non-Superflex, the specifics are different, but the problems are similar. If you pass on a QB here, when you wrap back around in the 3rd round, by the fact that round 3 started with Tua, and then you took Justin Fields, and then Trevor Lawrence goes at the 303, there's a pretty large tier break at that point. And in fact, in this particular draft, The next quarterback off the board didn't go until Daniel Jones went at the 509. So from the 303 to the 509, no quarterbacks selected in between. Colin, again, you had this great starting position. You went with Devontae Adams coming back in the second round and then took Justin Fields. How did you feel about this 3-round start, and then where did you go from there?
I was very positive with the 3-round start overall, and when we look at it, the pick for me, Devontae Adams and then into Justin Fields, I thought that there was a little bit of a tear break there until it would get to CeeDee Lamb. But fortunately for you in this draft, Shawn, CeeDee Lamb lasted to the 3-11. There was a strong run on running backs at that point, so that set up pretty well for you there. But it was a situation then I got Javonte Williams, TJ Hawkinson, then continued into a wide receiver run with DK Metcalf, Darnell Mooney, and Elijah Moore. I've been drafting a lot more DK Metcalf over the last 3 weeks or so, as I think that his ADP has become very, very palatable at his current prices. Then Tony Pollard and Sky Moore. So through those first 10 picks, I had 2 running backs, 1 tight end, and 2 quarterbacks. And it is a situation where if you get priced out a quarterback there, it can get a little bit tricky. So having that early pick was nice. Looking in hindsight, Fields was my target at the 2-11, and I did pass, and then I got him coming back around. Looking in hindsight, I had some concerns there. I probably should have went with Fields at that pick just to make sure that I did get him. Probably would have went Stephon Diggs if he lasted one more pick. But looking, Shawn, through it, Javonte Williams, we've talked about him in a few recent drafts. I like Javonte Williams, like getting him on those rosters, but we haven't, drafted him a huge amount in the underdog draft, so felt there was a good chance to get him here. We get TJ Hawkinson, one of our favorite guys, was kind of thinking that he may not make it back to me if I don't take him. So overall, I was pretty happy with how it went through those opening 10 rounds or so. Looking at my side of the draft, and then we'll look at your side. Through those 10 rounds, anything that you would look to change overall there?
Not necessarily. You have Darnell Mooney there with Justin Fields. I don't know that you necessarily have to pair that combo. You still have Rashad Bateman left. Terry McLaurin, we're not necessarily as high on him, but Jerry Jeudy, an interesting player, also lasting there. Tony Pollard in Superflex in round 9, an interesting pick. We've talked about him several times on the show recently. And then obviously in round 11, you get Albert O, so you get a couple of those top tight ends. This is a very nice build in terms of the balance. Perhaps in this format, you would prefer to have a stronger RB2. One of the things that we see, you mentioned that run on running backs in round 3 that allowed me to get CeeDee Lamb, which I was definitely very excited about. Obviously, he's an early to mid second round pick in traditional formats. But you have Dalvin Cook, Austin Eckler, Najee Harris, DeAndre Swift, Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon all going. You can understand that. And in this context, too, I think that there is some value to it where you lose one of those flex positions, essentially becomes a super flex. And once it becomes a super flex, then you do mostly want the QB to be jumping into that spot for you. It lessens a little bit the impact of a 0 RB build or the extra firepower that you get from having all of those early wide receivers. And yet you still do obviously want to be very strong at wide receiver. You want to have the wide receiver in the flex spot. So I was pretty happy to get Lamb coming back and then Debo wrapping around. I think that the running back picks then through rounds 4 and 5 were in some ways a little bit surprising. And Colm, I have to say that to be able to start Christian McCaffrey in a format that's a little more running back heavy, but then to get Nick Chubb and Cam Akers in rounds 5 and 6, that really felt like a gift that probably still shouldn't have been there. You look at some guys like Alvin Kamara and the suspension possibility. Obviously, we've been drafting Breece Hall. We like him. We've been drafting Travis Etienne, James Conner, a favorite. But to be able to get Nick Chubb after players like a Michael Pittman, after players like a Dalton Schultz, I like the way that this turned out. And one of the things that's very fun about playing Superflex is I think that there's a lot wider range of what could potentially happen when you jump into a draft. Cam Akers is one of these guys who looks a little bit undervalued right now. And so the decision to pass on a QB at the beginning, I think still I like, because if the QB that I eventually draft in round 7 does happen to hit, then for me, this is the type of early round star power that gives me a good chance to win the whole thing.
Yeah, I think you're really loaded at running back in this particular room. And it's interesting you mentioned about the running back too. I felt like having 2 running backs in those first 9 picks was probably at my optimum, like the higher end of the range of outcomes of what I was going to have. But you did mention it, and I, looking through the scoring, and we talk a lot about, the format and knowing your league scoring settings. And with this being Superflex, a lot of time with Superflex, it'll add an extra roster spot. This one, same number of roster spots, but one of those potential flexes to start a wide receiver does go to the quarterback. So you made a very good point there. But that was something that I had intended in this when I took the Javonte Williams pick in the 4th round. So interesting, no thoughts. And we have 2 kind of different builds overall in this. But the question then, just to see it out, was being Superflex, you've taken Ryan Tannehill in the 7th round, and then in the 19th round, paired him up with Malik Willis as your 3rd quarterback. So I have done something very similar with Albert Okwuegbunam and then Greg Dulcich, Okwuegbunam in the 11th and Dulcich in the 19th. What was your thought process on adding Malik Willis to the roster there? Was it just to make sure that, do you think that Tannehill potentially could lose that job throughout the season?
I don't know that he necessarily will. I expect him to play well. I expect this offense to function well. I drafted Treylon Burks and Robert Woods. Woods lasted well below ADP in this draft. He's not necessarily a target for me. But if he goes there and I'm making that bet on Tannehill for winning this tournament, then I do need Burks and Woods to both play relatively well. I think they could do that. And if we get to the end of the season and Tannehill is injured, or they do decide to make the switch, then I think Malik Willis could be a tournament-winning QB2 in Superflex. The other thing that happened here was that Eno Benjamin went 2 slots ahead of me in round 19. Once it got to that point, I didn't have multiple players that I necessarily wanted to still draft, so it was a flat spot at the other positions that also came into play. Now, it's not that there was absolutely no one that I could have gone with. Tommy Tremble, I think, is an interesting final round tight end. He did go at the 25, which was 3 picks after I selected Tyquan Thornton. So I selected Willis, came back with Thornton. He was still sort of the last player that I wanted to get in there. One of the things that happened for me nicely in this draft was I was able to get a variety of values on, in some cases, player targets, and in some cases, players who wouldn't be targets unless they were values, like a Brian Robinson, who I selected at 17-11, was able to get a variety of those rookie wide receivers in the aforementioned Burks, and then Dale Robinson, Tyquan Thornton, but then also some value picks in Julio Jones and Robert Woods. So kind of mixing old and young at the receiver position. The spot for me that could be a problem, but again, we address it with one of our favorite guys. I'm able to get Cole Kmet at the 10:02 and then Gerald Everett at the 12:02. I come back with Trey McBride, who, as I've mentioned a couple of places now, I'm going to go ahead and just draft everywhere and hope that he is the Pat Freiermuth of this season. I think the Arizona Cardinals obviously could score a lot of points, and if he does emerge, then it gives you that 3rd tight end. You really still need to have 3, I won't say powerful, but definitely competitive tight ends in this format. I either got boxed out or let myself get boxed out a little bit on the early tight ends. And then we know that there's that tight end dead zone. After that, I wanted to be aggressive. That's why I took both Kmet and Everett in the range where I did. We're projecting Everett to outscore ADP. If he does, I think my team will be in very good shape. If he doesn't, again, in this FFPC tight end premium format, maybe once you lose a flex position, the tight ends aren't as powerful from that perspective, whereas generally speaking, they're very viable flex options, especially in best ball where you don't have to pick out the start sit ahead of time. Once you lose one of those flexes, you think, okay, well, that's not as viable, but it actually then means that the tight end represents a larger share of the actual starting lineup between running back, wide receiver, and tight end. So again, you do need to dominate that tight end position. We'll see how it falls out from that perspective. But to be able to get the early running backs that I got, to be able to add a couple of fun late guys in Tyler Algier and Brian Robinson. Algier, despite his draft slot, continues to generate a bunch of rhetoric, at least in the direction of him potentially being the workhorse for the Falcons. And then to have decent wide receiver depth and mix. I like this particular team. I think it's got a great chance, and especially like it considering how many RotoViz drafters they were in here. As we know from the listener leagues, once you're drafting with like-minded people, both from a player evaluation perspective and from a structural perspective, obviously the RotoViz writers and yourself are using that roster construction explorer and have a good sense of what works and what doesn't in FFPC best ball.
Yeah, and one of the other things to give a plug for the tools on the website is the being able to see the ADP, and you mentioned this in a few shows recently in the grid format. So, being able to, rather than just see them in a listicle option, being able to see them where players are going. And I thought it was hugely beneficial throughout the draft process, especially against a sharp room like this. Shawn, I drafted from the 101. I teased it a moment ago. We won't go through it in huge detail, but I am going to share it with you here, and I'll share with the listeners. But I found, maybe it was just after the challenge of drafting against you and the other RotoViz writers, I found this one a little bit less challenging. It was also that I had the 101, but a couple of questions I have to get your thoughts on this overall build. Get the 101, take Josh Allen. Tom Brady falls quite some distance to the 212 where I take Tom Brady in this roster. First question for you, Shawn. Get Josh Allen, get Tom Brady. Don't draft another quarterback, a 2-quarterback build. Is that suboptimal in a Superflex tournament, do you think?
Well, there are going to be some strengths and weaknesses to it. The best ball tools suggest that it can be very effective. You want to use the rest of those picks to build out other positions. And once you get the top couple, if you're burning more picks at quarterback, and in many cases, those end up being throwaways. And so you've essentially cost yourself a roster spot. Now, if you do have a chance to get a good pick inexpensively, then I think that you want to go ahead and do that. One of the things that we have to consider from 2021, which is a lot of where the data comes from, since this particular Superflex tournament with FFPC is relatively new, is that last season was going to be very effective for sort of the early and elite tight end or early and elite QB build, whereas in some other seasons we have guys jump up from a little bit further down, like a Justin Herbert a couple of years ago, and that's going to change the dynamic quite a bit. But I think this can work, and it's certainly something that you want to consider tactically once you're in the draft, if the flow makes sense. Column after that, you take a long string of wide receivers. So again, you've used a pretty clear-cut 0 RB build in this tournament from the 101. How do you feel about your receivers, and did the running back room end up strong enough to make that payoff?
I'm hoping it has. I feel very good about it. The one note I'd say on the quarterbacks is in the draft that we did, that we talked about just a moment ago, quarterback 31 in that draft was Mitchell Trubisky in the 11th round. In this here particular draft, quarterback 31 was Deshaun Watson in the 8th round. Prior to him, we're at quarterback 29 in the 6th round in this draft. So it was a case where quarterback really went off the board very early, and then that left me in a situation where, unless things like you said fell correctly, I was really kind of hoping that maybe one of the, for example, the Seahawks quarterbacks may have got to mirror that, but that never happened at any particular point. But in terms of the wide receivers that I have drafted, it's Stephon Diggs, who I know we're not trying to force stacks into these sort of things, but that's kind of exactly where he goes at ADP at the 301. So we get Allen and Diggs, we get AJ Brown, we get George Kittle, Jalen Waddle, Mike Williams, Rashad Perryman, Chris Godwin. You mentioned the wide receiver, Shawn. I don't think there's any doubt, the running backs. I don't think there's any doubt that the wide receivers are strong enough. But Devin Singletary and Kenneth Walker, who are both people I considered at the 8-9 turn, were there at the at the 9-10 turn. No, they were back-to-back picks. 10, 11.
Yeah, you're saying that you considered them at the 8-9, but
Yeah,
they got
yeah.
to the 10-11.
Devin Singletary and Kenneth Walker were both people I considered at the 8-9 turn when I took Bateman and Chris Godwin, and they lasted through. So I couldn't believe my luck when that worked out. Kenny Pickett, Christian Kirk, Michael Thomas went in the picks just before that, and they were pretty much auto picks for me at that particular point. Then it went Tyler Boyd, Albert Okwuegbunam, Kenneth Gainwell, Tyrion Davis-Price, Sony Michel, Chris Evans, Trey McBride, Jerick McKinnon, and I finished out with Isaiah McKenzie. That was on the Isaiah McKenzie buzzworthy news day. I think, Sean, the running backs for a zero RB build have finished out pretty strong. To get Singletary, Walker, and Gainwell, I think, is very positive. And then two of my favorite late guys are Michelle and Evans, and to pair that up then as well with McKinnon, I thought worked out pretty well. I felt a lot of people based on ADP, or a lot of players in this, slipped, half a round to get back to me. So I thought overall it was pretty positive. The two quarterback bit was the bit that I thought about, but I'm rolling with those two guys, and I think it may be my favorite team I've drafted this year so far.
Was there any interest in perhaps taking Isaiah Spiller where you selected Tyler Boyd, or going with the two tight ends? We talked about that in a couple of the drafts recently. Ben and I had a draft where there were multiple occasions where maybe going back-to-back at tight end would have worked. If you had gone with Albert O and Noah Fant at the 12-13, then you would have had the round 18 pick freed up to select, Benjamin, for example. Do you prefer having Boyd in there still with the top guys that you mentioned? Obviously, when you have Diggs, Brown, Waddle, Mike Williams, Rashad Bateman, and then Chris Godwin, you have a lot of different ways that you can potentially win this tournament. I'm pretty excited for you.
Yeah, in terms of that pick, the reason I took Tyler Boyd there, and again, we're not forcing stacks, but week 17, we have the Bills and the Bengals, and that felt like with the Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, and I already had Singletary at that point, it felt like getting Boyd in there made a lot of sense. That was part of the thinking as well with the Chris Evans pick. So I probably wouldn't. I was also thinking that, Fant may have continued to last a little bit. The other player that was there and available was Gerald Everett at that point. He also went off the board before it came back to me. So there was quite a tight end run. And Sean, Brevin Jordan even went off the board before I got my next pick. You'll be able to see there as well. But there was a big run on tight ends between the Albert O pick and how things played out. And Okwuegbunam went tight end 16 in this. So I felt like that was too much. He's usually going about a round earlier, and he was going in that Fant range then. So very much understand the thought process there, but also excited to get some more Trey McBride, particularly in the FFPC tight end premium format. So happy with how this roster played out overall. We'll see how it goes throughout the season, but after getting the opportunity to go back-to-back in the Superflex format with two quarterbacks who, no issues with job security at all outside of injuries happening, tempted to maybe try and get a few more two quarterback builds in this FFPC tournament. So we'll see how that plays out. The one I'm currently drafting from the 105, started off in that just one pick in with Joe Burrow. So we'll see what options are available in the second round, but might try this out and see how it plays out on a couple of occasions. But fun drafting in the FFPC Superflex Tournament, $35 entry. Would highly recommend having a go over there at myffpc.com if you haven't done so already.